lecture, we look at complex negotiation situations. How, as a leader, do you advance your own agenda, satisfy your own goals and objectives, while also helping other parties satisfy some of their own needs and desires as well? How do you get to the root of people's interests and find a situation where efforts to advance own agendas don't end up leading to suboptimal overall organizational outcomes? Let's take a look at one famous incident of an incredibly complex negotiation process, one that many regard as a very successful process, led by President George Herbert Walker Bush in 1990 and 91. As you recall, in 1990, Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, invaded his neighboring country of Kuwait. It shocked the world at the time that he was so brazen enough as to pour troops and equipment across the border and take over this sovereign country. Kuwait, of course, was a close ally of the United States, as well as other neighboring Arab countries, such as Saudi Arabia. Now, what did Bush do to confront this aggression? Now, what he chose to do was not yet act unilaterally, nor to act too quickly in deciding his course of action. He knew, as he said, that this could not stand, but he had to figure out what was the right strategy. How do we handle that? And with whom are we going to work to figure out that strategy? His overall approach was to gradually build a series of United Nations resolutions, working with a variety of allies and other countries in the Middle East to get those passed, working also with the Soviet Union, of course, who was on the Security Council of the United Nations and with whose support he needed. Gradually, those resolutions started from condemnation of the invasion to ultimately support for the use of force to stop Hussein, to evict him and his army from Kuwait. But that took place over time. How did he build the coalition that many people refer to, this broad and deep coalition of various countries who all came together, not just to support the invasion, but also to commit equipment and troops and to provide logistical support for the principal military, the U.S. military, that was involved in getting Hussein and the Iraqi military out of Kuwait? He began, of course, in meeting with close allies. He met with Margaret Thatcher. He actually had a meeting already pre-planned with British leader Margaret Thatcher, and he went ahead with that. Also, obviously, the agenda had changed. It had focused now on this crisis situation. He began to think about King Fahd, the leader of Saudi Arabia. He knew that Saudi Arabia would be critical in any response. If, in fact, the use of force was going to be required, then logistical support, the ability to stage troops and equipment in Saudi Arabia, would be critical. There probably would be no other way to get the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait than to have American military forces based in Saudi Arabia. So he knew that they had much at stake. After all, the next country that Hussein might invade after Kuwait might indeed be Saudi Arabia. So he knew that they had great interests in reversing this particular act of aggression. He reached out to the Soviets. Now, why them? Well, he knew that in order to get broader United Nations support, he would probably need the Soviets on his side. He saw this, too, as a first chance to engage in a very different relationship with them after the major changes that had taken place after the Berlin Wall fell and changes swept through Eastern Europe. He also knew that James Baker, one of his closest aides, and Shevardnadze, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, had built a bit of a relationship. Bush, too, had relationships with many world leaders, having served as vice president, having worked at the UN, having led the CIA, so many roles he'd had in the federal government, and he now worked off of the trusting relationships he had built over decades in order to negotiate with various parties. He identified several countries in the Middle East who were most likely to want to cooperate in helping to reverse this act of aggression. He knew that Egypt would be a country he could work with. This was a country that America had supported with various foreign aid and shipments of weapons over the years. He also knew, of course, that Egypt had come to a peace agreement with Israel, and so they were more likely to perhaps be open to working with the U.S. in this coalition. Similarly, he reached out to King Hussein of Jordan. Interestingly, Bush gave them time to discuss what they thought should be done before publicly calling on them to denounce the invasion. He let them have some time. They asked for it. He granted it. And Even then, King Hussein went to Baghdad to try to reason with the Iraqi leader. Ultimately, he didn't get the kind of concessions that were desirable. In fact, although Mubarak, the leader of Egypt at the time, openly condemned the Iraqi leader soon after that meeting that King Hussein had in Baghdad, this took King Hussein a bit by surprise. But to Bush, he saw the progress being made. He saw now that they were beginning to speak more openly, having tried themselves to reason with the Iraqi leader. He shared intelligence with these various countries as well, showing them the threat to them, particularly to the Saudis. And he worked over time, recognizing that some of these countries were dependent on the U.S. for foreign aid, for support, and even for the sale of military equipment. And he knew that that dependency gave him some leverage. But he didn't exercise it in a threatening way, instead working much more subtly to gain their support. Ultimately, the series of United Nations resolutions passed, and this coalition worked together around a common set of interests to bring freedom to Kuwait. It's a very interesting example of seeing negotiation as a process that must unfold over time in many circumstances. Not an event that can take place very quickly, but one that requires a chance to give people the opportunity to share their ideas, their goals and objectives, one where you're working to understand their position as well as why they have taken that position, and then coming to common ground. Ultimately, he had an agenda. He felt it was necessary to evict Iraq from Kuwait, and he gradually came to the understanding that it was going to take force. But he didn't impose his will. He negotiated his way to a solution. Corporations, too, have to face these kinds of complex negotiations, perhaps not as complex as the Gulf War Coalition in 1991, but they definitely face conflicts and situations where people have to advance their own interests, but sometimes in so doing, they actually get to suboptimal outcomes for the corporation. Many companies, for example, get into bitter conflicts around budget season. You have units fighting over things like transfer prices or what targets should be set in terms of financial performance. A transfer price is the price at which one unit essentially sells some component to another unit who's going to use it in the production of a product. They're not really selling it because they both work for the corporation. It's sort of a fake price by which they transact. It's used to help evaluate performance of each unit. They're sort of replicating what would happen if these were independent entities out in the marketplace. And fights often take place over the right price. After all, the seller wants to get the highest transfer price possible, and the buyer within the corporation wants the lowest price, just as any market participants would want. I can recall fights over these kinds of things when I was in the private sector. One unit of a company I worked for providing transportation services to the other, and the units never realizing that they could use their collective clout to actually go and renegotiate with outside vendors and get better terms. They were fighting over comparisons of financial performance that were taking place between the two units. One unit, the poor performer, thinking this was really not a fair comparison, it was apples to oranges. And their concern over that clouding the fact they could work together perhaps to actually achieve much better results. They were looking at it as a zero-sum game. I win, you lose. And in those circumstances, relationships are torn and suboptimal solutions arise. Parties don't realize they can actually cooperate to achieve much better gains. We see this too, according to Gould and Campbell, two corporate strategy scholars, when we look at corporations trying to achieve synergies. They describe something called the parenting bias, sort of the opposite problem of the one I just described of the fighting units and transfer prices. In this case, we have a corporate office who thinks it knows best for the company and for the units that it oversees. And it often assumes in that kind of situation that units might not be pursuing synergistic opportunities because people are thinking in their silos, overprotective of turf, or engaging in the not invented here syndrome. And they give an example of a food company where the corporate office was getting very frustrated. It believed that the units needed to work together on a joint advertising campaign to promote products. The local units resisted. And corporate office thought they were simply engaging in silo thinking. But in fact, there were real legitimate reasons why they felt they needed to tailor the campaign to local markets, not use one joint one. And that was not seen by the corporate office. So the lesson from these examples, beware the zero-sum game. Beware of not understanding why people aren't cooperating with you. That leads us to the broader point, which is when it comes to negotiation, we often are facing this tension between what scholars call value-claiming behavior and value-creating behavior. The prisoner's dilemma actually highlighted that tension quite nicely. See, value-creating behavior is about growing the size of the whole pie, working together with another party to create more value that could then be split between or among multiple parties. Value-claiming behavior is about getting the largest piece of the pie for yourself. Unfortunately, value-claiming behavior, getting the biggest piece of the pie, often crowds out value creation. In fact, in many situations, people view situations as zero-sum games. They don't even see the opportunity for win-win outcomes. They don't see the opportunity to grow the size of the pie. They're just fighting over the size of their own slice. The leader's job, of course, is to help others discover these opportunities, to ensure that value-claiming behavior doesn't crowd out all potential for collaborative value creation within an organization. There's a problem here with regard to tactics in these kinds of conflict resolution situations. The tactics used to claim value often are what obstruct the creation of value. For example, a person involved in one of these kinds of conflicts might be intentionally distorting or providing an inaccurate picture of their own personal preferences in order to gain advantage, leverage. But of course, in order to actually create value together, we need to understand people's preferences and their underlying goals. Excessive use of claiming tactics, of using hardball negotiation to get your goals achieved, can reduce trust, trigger interpersonal conflict, and harm a relationship that may be critical for high organizational performance over the long run. Attempts and tactics used to create value can also make one vulnerable, though, to others' attempts to claim value. Think about that for a moment. If you're trying to be collaborative, you can actually make yourself vulnerable to another player's hardball tactics to gain advantage over you. And that's problematic. We want to create joint value, to collaborate to come to a better outcome for the whole organization, but we don't want to be taken advantage of. And that's the trouble. That's why we have this fundamental tension that's difficult to resolve. David Lax and Jim Sabinius argue that we think of negotiation from a leader's perspective. We can think about organizations really as networks of agreements. In that mental model, leaders can think of their job as creating, influencing, sustaining, and altering agreements among various units and parties within the organization. How do you do that as a leader? How do you shape the nature of agreements among parties in the organization so that people are finding the most collaborative value and not leaving value on the table because they're simply pursuing their own agenda? Well, they would argue there's two broad ways to get to beneficial agreements. One is, as an individual, you can make the other party's alternatives seem worse. And the other is you can highlight and enhance the potential for joint action and joint gains. Let's take a look at both of those. First, they would argue, you need, in order to be successful in resolving disputes and negotiating with other parties, to see that they do have different interests. And you have to understand the alternatives to agreement that each party has. They describe what they call the BATNA. That is, another party's best alternative to negotiated agreement. Do you understand your own BATNA, they would say. That's the first step. Do you understand your best alternative to getting to a negotiated agreement? And you'd like to be able to understand their best alternative. Alternatives to agreement essentially frame the limits of a negotiation. Put another way, they help us define what negotiation scholars call the ZOPA, the zone of possible agreement. What room is there to come to a solution that we can both live with? In order to understand where that space is, we need to understand what's people's walkaway position. I mean, what will they do if they don't come to an agreement? So beyond that, of course, then we know that negotiators, that parties in a situation are going to take positions on a range of issues. Of course, underlying those positions are a set of interests. Often, when we're in a situation of conflict, people tend to focus on their positions, and they can easily become hardened in those positions. And as a result, we get polarization and impasse. We get lots and lots of value-claiming behavior as people simply say, this is my position and I'm sticking to it, And they're not really talking about their underlying goals and objectives. They're not talking about why they hold that particular view. They're simply reiterating their position louder and more forcefully and more assertively to try to get their way, to try to claim as much value. We see a lot of that, and we see a lot of polarization when it comes to negotiations. We have to recognize that in these kinds of situations, people aren't just worried about how much in terms of a quantifiable economic benefit they get from a situation. People also care about perceptions of fairness when it comes to a situation and the resolution of a situation. And leaders need to be aware of how fairness matters to their people. Every negotiation scholar often starts a semester fairly early on with a simple economic experiment that's called the ultimatum game. What they do is they have two people they pick out in class, and they tell one player that their job is to divide a sum of money between the two people, themselves and the other party. The first player is to propose how to divide the sum between the two players, and the second player can either accept or reject the proposal. If the second player rejects, then neither player receives a dime. If the second player accepts, the money is split according to the original proposal. What do scholars find? Well, think about it for a moment. If the party receiving the proposal is rational, shouldn't they take any offer from the other party? Say the first party is dividing $10. Suppose they decide to take $9.50 for themselves and offer 50 cents to the other party. Well, if you reject that proposal, you're going to get nothing. 50 cents is better than nothing, so wouldn't you always accept anything more than zero is better than zero, isn't it? It turns out that's not the way human beings behave. An offer of a 50-50 split is usually accepted. An offer of an 85-15 split is often rejected. In other words, if you propose to keep 85% of the money for yourself and only offer the other party 15%, they will reject it and take nothing instead of the 15%. Fairness matters. So we need to understand that when we think about how to get to solutions that people will buy into. Roger Fisher and William Ury wrote a very famous book on negotiation to help people understand how to get to outcomes that people perceived as fair, how to get to outcomes where people were achieving mutual gains. Their model of dispute resolution was outlined in a book called Getting to Yes, a very famous book on negotiation, that they felt was useful, as I say, for leaders inside organizations, not just when dealing with external parties. They had 4 basic principles they outlined. Focus on interests, not positions. Separate the people from the problem. Invent options for mutual gain, and insist on using objective criteria whenever possible. Let's first start with the interests versus positions issue. The idea is to get people to share or disclose their interests, because in so doing, there are opportunities for collective gain, for value creation, and they become more apparent. Opportunities to creatively resolve disputes become more apparent if people share their underlying motives, goals, and objectives. Separating people from the problem. Here they're arguing that you need to step into others' shoes and not jump to conclusions about their intentions. Don't blame them for your problem. Discuss each other's perceptions. Give them a stake in the outcome by making sure they participate in the process. Make them feel like they own this process and the outcome of it. As a leader, that's so important, making your people feel like they own a particular issue and the solution, not having them feel like you're imposing something on them if they're in a dispute with some other party in the organization. Look for ways to act inconsistently with the perceptions of another party. In other words, if there's a chance to pleasantly surprise them in some way, that can often elicit lots of goodwill and build trust. And remember that face saving is important. Don't back other parties into a corner. Like doing that with a wild animal, you might expect a very, very angry response, them to lash back out at you if you back them into a corner. Interests, not positions. You know, what can you do to get to that? And do it while separating people from the problem. You have to ask lots of questions, it turns out, as a leader. It's fundamental to getting people to share and collaborate. Ask them why they feel a certain way and why they aren't in favor of certain kinds of ideas. Realize that there may be multiple goals and objectives there, not just a single agenda that they're pursuing. Think about their basic human needs. Remember they're people, and they have certain things they care about that may have nothing to do with the organization's overall strategy, but have to do with their own feelings about job security, about their career, about their family life and work-life balance. Make a list of as many of these interests that you can identify. Make them come alive. And put the problem before the answer. Don't jump to conclusions as to what the best way to resolve this dispute is. And always try to keep people looking forward, not back. Looking to where they can go, not to the past disputes and interpersonal friction and personality clashes that have bogged them down. Not to the silo thinking of the past that everybody kind of keeps going to when arguing why they can't come to a solution. How do you invent options for mutual gain? How do you figure out where these new solutions are that are win-wins for everyone? Fisher and Ury argue that you have to separate inventing from deciding. In other words, you have to start by saying, let's not worry about what the solution is and how we're going to split the pie. Let's just brainstorm together. Let's work on the same side of the table for a moment and broaden the set of options before us. More options is always better. Look through the eyes of different experts, maybe even bring in some outside experts to help us invent options. Invent agreements with different strengths, meaning some are better for one party, others are better for the different party that's involved. That's okay, but get ones of different weights in there. And potentially change the scope of agreement too. Maybe we're debating about a particular product line. Maybe we ought to be thinking about multiple product lines in this dispute. Broadening it may actually create the opportunity for a more comprehensive solution that everyone can live with and that satisfies individual units' objectives more effectively. Changing the game, the scope of the agreement, is very, very inventive, very creative, and it's often not done. People fixate on the one issue that they've been debating and that they're in conflict on, and they don't think about how it might be related to other issues. Thinking about bundles of issues rather than ideas and problems in isolation can be an effective way to get to better collaborative solutions as you try to negotiate through conflicts in organizations. Interestingly, we have to ask ourselves, what are the sources of these collaborative joint gains that might be found in organizations? Well, certainly shared interests. That's easy, right? If we discover that we actually share the same goals, we just didn't realize it, that's a wonderful thing. There may be scale and scope economies. In other words, there may be ways that we can simply do better together than apart. And the most important one, the one that often is not seen, one key source of joint gains is the notion of differences. When differences sometimes provide an opportunity for trading, if you will, between parties. Fisher and Ury say gain from negotiation often exists because negotiators differ from one another. Since they're not identical in tastes, forecasts, endowments, capabilities, and other ways, they each have something to offer that's relatively less valuable to them than to those with whom they're bargaining. In other words, differences actually form the basis of agreement. We don't think about that often. Instead, we go to the issue of, well, are there things we share in common, goals we share in common? We jump to, is there common ground? In fact, that's the frequent diplomatic advice. First, reach common ground on facts, assumptions, forecasts, then bargain hard based on that common terrain. But it might be the wrong advice. They argue instead that differences among negotiators are often the engine that drives joint action and might lead to potential collective gains. That's a very interesting idea. It's counterintuitive in a way, that out of our differences can arise an agreement that satisfies us all. But think about it for a minute. Let me give you a fable that they love to tell about two sisters. Negotiation scholars love this one. Two sisters fighting over an orange. They're having a big fight. There's only one orange left in the house. They both want it. And they're yelling at each other. The parents arrive home and ask what the fuss is all about. One sister replies, I'm making orange juice, and I need that final orange to complete my effort. And the other sister says, well, I'm baking cookies, and I need that final orange to complete my effort. And we didn't have a car. We couldn't go out to the store. And quickly, of course, the parents realize that this fight is fruitless. That in fact, they both could have satisfied their goals and objectives with the one orange. Baking cookies required the peel, and making juice required the interior of the orange. Neither side understood why they wanted the orange, so they were just fighting over their position, which was, I need the orange more than you. But if they'd uncovered their underlying interests, which were different, they could have come to an agreement that would have satisfied both parties. Out of differences could have arisen a collective outcome satisfying to both parties. We don't think of that. We often focus on that common ground, or we're told to. But understanding your differences can be a powerful way to negotiate to a better outcome. What kinds of differences in interests ought we pay attention to? Well, do we value certain things differently? Do we have different forecasts of the future? Do we have different attitudes toward risk? Different preferences over when we would like to do certain things or receive certain funds? Do we have different capabilities or weaknesses? Are we evaluating certain topics, projects, and the like with different criteria? Do we have different conceptions of fairness? These sorts of differences can actually be the root of a potential agreement. Suppose, for example, that one party has a much higher discount rate than the other. Well, what is a discount rate? A discount rate is sort of how we value money over time. In other words, do we put a lot of value on a dollar today versus a dollar tomorrow? Or are we more likely to be patient and willing to wait for those dollars in the future? In other words, think about it. Mike really needs cash flow now because he values a dollar today much more than a dollar tomorrow. But Sally has a much longer-term perspective in terms of financial returns, and she doesn't discount dollars earned in the out years nearly as much. Well, that difference in perspective might be the basis for a resolution. Sally might be willing to offer accelerated payment to Mike in return for other benefits, given that Mike gets more value from that acceleration than Sally is giving up by taking dollars later. So out of their differences comes a potential agreement. Lastly, Fisher and Ury argue that we should insist on using objective criteria whenever possible. And here's where fairness comes in. Fair standards and a fair procedure are important to people. They don't just care about the outcome being fair. They want to know that whatever process is being used to adjudicate a situation is fair and legitimate. You want to be open to reason and not yielding to pressure, only to principle as you negotiate. The extent to which you can find objective criteria that's useful, of course, in many situations you won't be able to. The criteria are fundamentally subjective, and that is a challenge in many situations. So, as we conclude, we think about the leader's job. The leader's job isn't just to find solutions. The leader's job is actually to be the architect, the designer of the negotiating environment, shaping how disputes are resolved in the organization. That's an important job for the leader, not to go in and solve every dispute on their own, but to shape the negotiating environment so people are doing a better job of creating value, not just claiming it. So that means sort of shaping the philosophy, getting people to hold off on discussing their positions and focus on interests first, getting to invent options first, to brainstorm together, and to defer judgment and criticism of one another at times. Breaking up the process, getting them to focus on some low-hanging fruit if they can at first. Invoking the fact that they are going to repeatedly have to deal with one another, getting them to focus on building a long-term relationship of trust and cooperation. Setting good cooperative norms and ground rules. And then socializing people into the organization around an ethos of cooperation and not just internal competition. Those are the ways in which you can shape the way disputes are resolved in your organization. And in so doing, in shaping that negotiating environment, say Lax and Sabinius, you can actually be very productive as a leader without actually going in and having to resolve all the disputes yourself. You don't have time to do all that, after all. So what are our takeaways? Clearly, understanding people's goals and objectives, not just their positions, and getting people to talk about their preferences and objectives, and not just hold to their polarizing positions. To recognize that differences are at the heart of potentially fruitful agreements, so critical. And as a leader, to understand that part of your job is to get everyone to look at everything as more than a zero-sum game, as a chance to grow the pie in many circumstances. To ask lots of questions as a leader is so important to uncover opportunities for mutual gain. Watch the use of language in any dispute. Something a leader needs to do. Calling time out, getting people to back off when the language is getting heated, angry, and emotional is a critical job for any leader. And recognizing, finally, that people's perceptions of fairness matter. That in the ultimatum game, even though 50 cents is better than nothing, they will walk away from the 50 cents if they believe it's a fundamentally unfair outcome. And that sense of fairness is important to keep in mind in all situations where people are in conflict and we're trying to get to a solution that they're willing to buy in and commit to moving forward.